I've always believed that a mother's home should be a place of peace, a little corner of the world where warmth still lives, even when the rest of it grows cold. And for most of my life, that's exactly what my home was. My husband and I built it from the ground up back when the neighborhood was still half dirt and promise. Back when our hands were younger and our hearts were louder. It wasn't much, just a 2-bedroom house on a quiet street, but it held everything that mattered. Our laughter, our struggles, our son's first steps, his first heartbreak, and the echo of his voice calling me, Mama, long after he'd grown too tall to fit in my lap. After my husband passed away, that house became my anchor, and my son Ethan became my reason to keep the lights on. He was always a gentle soul, the kind of boy who apologized even when things weren't his fault. The kind who'd give you his last dollar and say he didn't need it anyway. So when he told me he was getting married, I smiled even though something inside me whispered caution. Her name was Natalie. She was pretty confident, maybe too confident, the kind of young woman who walked into a room and made everyone feel like they had to prove themselves. I told myself not to judge her too quickly. After all, times had changed. The world didn't need women like me anymore, soft-spoken and patient. It seemed to need women who spoke fast and loved louder. The wedding came and went, and I clapped and smiled and told everyone how happy I was. But a mother knows when her smile doesn't reach her heart. It started small after that. Natalie would visit, and her eyes would skim over my furniture like she was measuring what didn't belong. When I offered her tea, she'd say, "No thanks, we don't drink that kind anymore," as if the world had outgrown my kitchen too. I tried not to mind. I reminded myself that she was young and maybe nervous, that she'd find her way to kindness once she felt safe in this family. But safety wasn't something she was looking for. It was control. It became clearer when Ethan started visiting less, when phone calls grew shorter, when I noticed the pauses in his voice, the kind that come from having to choose words carefully. I told myself not to interfere, that every marriage had its storms, but one afternoon when I called and Natalie answered, she said, "Ethan's busy, Mrs. Coleman. Maybe call next week if you really need something." The way she said it, Mrs. Coleman, not Mom, cut deeper than I expected. It wasn't disrespectful on the surface, but tone has its own kind of cruelty. Still, I bit my tongue. I told myself it wasn't worth it. But the breaking point came one winter evening, the air cold enough to sting my lungs when I stepped outside. They came by unannounced, Ethan looking tired, Natalie wearing her sharp perfume, and that distant smile. I made them dinner, but pot roast like Ethan used to love, but halfway through the meal she pushed her plate aside and said, "You know, Mom." "Oh, wait, sorry, Mrs. Coleman. You really shouldn't be cooking anymore. It's time you start resting. You've done your part." Her tone was sugar with vinegar underneath. I forced a small laugh, thinking she was joking, but then she leaned back in her chair and said it. Those words that would sit in my chest for weeks. "You're getting old and kind of useless, aren't you?" My fork slipped from my hand and clattered against the plate. Ethan looked at her in shock, ready to speak, but she silenced him with a look. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The room felt too small, the air too thick, and all I could think was that somehow I'd raised my son to love someone who saw me as disposable. They left early that night, and when the door closed behind them, the quiet felt different. It wasn't peace. It was the sound of something breaking. I sat there for a long time, just staring at the empty plates, until I realized my hands were shaking. I wasn't angry yet. Anger would come later. That night I was just hollow, but somewhere beneath the ache, something else began to stir. Because a woman may grow old, but she doesn't grow weak. And a mother who's been underestimated learns faster than anyone how to remind the world of her worth. The days after that dinner felt heavier than usual, the kind of days where silence weighs more than words ever could. And though I tried to go about my routine, watering the plants, folding laundry, keeping the kettle warm, everything I touched seemed to echo with that one cruel sentence, "Old and useless, I told myself to let it go, that she was young and reckless with her tongue, but no matter how I tried to shake it off, her voice lingered like a stain that wouldn't wash away. Ethan called once that week, his tone careful, as if he was walking across thin ice. "Mom," he said, "Natalie didn't mean it that way. You know how she is." I smiled into the receiver even though my throat felt tight, and said, "Of course, darling, don't worry." But worry was all I did. I thought about how many years I'd spent building a life that mattered, raising a son, keeping a home, holding everything together after my husband died, and now here I was, being told that all of it counted for nothing. That night, I sat by the window, looking out at the snow piling on the porch steps, and made myself a quiet promise I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't shout, but I would remind Natalie that age isn't weakness. It's wisdom sharpened by time. So I waited. I waited for the right moment, the right reason, and as it turns out, I didn't have to wait long. The next week, Ethan and Natalie decided to host a small dinner at their new home, a modern place filled with glass, metal, and all the things she said made a house look alive. She invited me with a message that sounded more like obligation than kindness. "We're having people over. You can come if you'd like." I smiled at that. If I'd like. I decided I would go, but not as the quiet old woman she thought she could belittle. I spent that morning polishing my shoes, curling my hair the way I used to when my husband was alive, and choosing the blue dress he always said made my eyes look young. When I arrived, the house was filled with chatter, laughter, and the hum of music that didn't belong to my generation. Natalie looked surprised to see me, and for a moment, I saw uncertainty flicker behind her eyes. I brought her a small gift, a set of fine china cups that had belonged to my mother. "I thought you might like these," I said gently, placing the box on the table. She opened it, and her lips curved into that half smile that never reached her eyes. "Oh, vintage," she said, her tone dripping with mock appreciation. Old, fashioned." I nodded. "Yes, dear. Some things only get more valuable with age." Her smile faltered, just slightly, and I felt a flicker of satisfaction. Through the evening, I watched her. The way she tried to impress her guests with stories, the way she dismissed Ethan's opinions, and the way she looked through people instead of at them. And then I saw it, the crack in her perfection. When dessert came, she dropped a tray of glass bowls, and instead of owning the mistake, she snapped at one of the guests, blaming him for standing too close. The room went quiet. People looked uncomfortable. That's when I stood up, not in anger, but with the calmness that comes from having nothing to prove. I walked over, picked up one of the unbroken bowls, and said softly, "It's all right, Natalie. Accidents happen. What matters is how we handle them. You'll learn that someday." Her cheeks flushed, and she muttered something under her breath, but the damage was done. Everyone had seen it. The facade had cracked. I didn't need to humiliate her, and I didn't plan to. My lesson wasn't about revenge, it was about grace. Because sometimes, the best way to teach someone respect isn't by shouting. It's by showing them the strength in silence. When I left that night, the snow had stopped falling, and for the first time in weeks, I felt light. Natalie hadn't apologized yet, but I knew she would. Sooner or later. Life has a way of humbling those who forget the hands that came before them. It was 2 weeks after that dinner when the call came, late in the afternoon. The kind of quiet hour where you can hear the refrigerator hum and the clock tick like it's counting down to something. I saw Ethan's name flash on my phone, and before I could even say hello, his voice came through, shaky and tense. "Mom, Natalie's in trouble." My heart froze. He explained quickly. Her parents were out of town, and she'd been home alone when the storm hit. The power had gone out across the neighborhood, and, in her panic to get candles from the basement, she'd slipped down the stairs. She couldn't get up, her ankle swollen and possibly broken. "The roads are bad," Ethan said. "I'm stuck at work. No one else can reach her." Without thinking, I grabbed my coat keys and the old flashlight from the drawer. Snow was coming down hard again, the sky dim and heavy, but my feet moved before my fear could. The drive there felt endless, the wind scraping at the windows, my hands tight around the wheel. When I finally reached their house, the driveway was buried under snow, and the lights inside were out. I banged on the door and called her name, but no answer came, only the hollow sound of the storm. I used the spare key Ethan had once given me, pushed the door open, and the cold hit me like a slap. The house was eerily quiet, just the faint creak of wood and the soft whimper of someone in pain. I followed the sound down to the basement, my flashlight trembling slightly in my hand, and there she was, Natalie, sitting against the steps, tears streaking her face, one hand clutching her ankle. The sight of her, so fragile, so scared, cut through every ounce of resentment I'd been holding. "Oh, sweetheart," I whispered, rushing to her side. Her eyes widened when she saw me, disbelief flickering there. You came," she stammered. I smiled, kneeling beside her. "Of course I came." I checked her ankle, wrapping it gently with my scarf to keep it steady. She winced but didn't pull away. "I tried calling for help," she said, her voice breaking. No one answered. I looked at her, this girl who had called me useless, now clinging to me like a child, and my heart softened completely. "You're safe now," I said, brushing her hair back. "That's all that matters." I helped her up slowly, supporting her weight as we climbed the stairs one careful step at a time. By the time I got her settled on the couch, the candles were flickering, casting soft light across her face. She looked small, so different from the confident, sharp-tongued woman I'd met before. "I'm sorry," she whispered suddenly, tears spilling again. "For what I said, for how I treated you. I didn't mean." I stopped her gently, pressing her hand. "You don't have to explain, dear. Sometimes we only learn the value of someone when we fall and realize who picks us up." She nodded, sobbing quietly, and in that moment, I wasn't her mother-in-law. I was just a mother again, holding someone who needed me. I made her soup from the pantry, wrapped her leg with a towel, and stayed with her until she fell asleep. As I sat there watching her breathe, I felt something shift in both of us. Maybe pain is life's cruelest teacher, but it's also the one that makes lessons stick. When Ethan finally arrived home at dawn, he found me dozing in a chair, Natalie still sleeping soundly. He looked from her to me and said softly, "You stayed all night." I smiled and nodded. That's what mothers do. And though she hadn't said it outright, I could feel it. The respect, the warmth, the unspoken thank you. That day, without realizing it, Natalie learned the lesson I'd never needed to teach with words. The days that followed changed something subtle yet deep between us, something I could feel even before words acknowledged it. Natalie began calling me more often, small check-ins about the weather, a new recipe, or how my roses were doing, the kind of everyday talk that once felt impossible between us. When I visited to bring her meals, she no longer kept that polite distance. She'd pat the couch beside her, invite me to sit, ask about Ethan's childhood stories, even laugh softly when I told her how clumsy he used to be. I saw the shift most clearly in her eyes. The sharpness that once lived there had softened, replaced by something almost childlike. Curiosity, humility, maybe even affection. She was still proud. Still learning how to apologize fully, but I didn't need the words. I could see it in the way she watched me when I cooked, or how she'd listen quietly when I talked about my late husband, as though she was piecing together who I was beyond the title of mother-in-law. One afternoon, as sunlight spilled across her living room, she said, "You must miss him, your husband." I nodded, feeling the ache that never really leaves. "Every day?" I said softly. "But missing someone isn't always sadness. It's love that doesn't know where to go." She looked at me for a long moment, then said, "Ethan told me you worked 2 jobs after he passed, just to keep the house." I smiled faintly. "Yes. A mother does what she must." She lowered her gaze, her voice trembling a little. "I used to think being strong meant having control, but I see now it's about how much you can carry quietly." That confession, it It wasn't loud, but it meant everything. I reached over, placing my hand over hers, and said, "Strength doesn't always roar, Natalie. Sometimes it just whispers, keep going." From that day, she tried, truly tried. She helped me in the garden, brought groceries without being asked, even insisted on teaching me how to use her fancy smartphone, laughing when I got frustrated with the touch screen. Slowly, we began to build something real, not perfection, but understanding. Yet life, as it always does, had one more test in store for both of us. One evening, Ethan came home pale and quiet, holding a letter that trembled in his hand. "Mom," he said, his voice low, "it's about Dad's old land deal. Someone's claiming the property was never fully transferred. There's talk of a lawsuit." My heart dropped. That land was the last piece of my husband's legacy, the ground he'd worked and dreamed over for decades. Natalie saw my face pale and immediately put her hand on my shoulder. "Don't worry," she said firmly. "We'll handle it together." For the first time, I saw her not as the girl who had hurt me, but as a woman ready to stand beside me. It was strange, comforting, and bittersweet all at once. Life has a way of circling back, of testing the bonds it has just begun to mend. As I sat there, listening to the wind outside and feeling Natalie's steady hand on mine, I realized something powerful. Sometimes the lessons we give come back to teach us, too. The letter lay on the table between us like a ghost from another time, its paper yellowed at the edges, the ink smudged where someone's hand had pressed too hard. Ethan explained that an old business partner of his father's, a man named Grant Holloway, was claiming partial ownership of the farmland my late husband had bought 40 years ago. That land wasn't just soil and fences, it was memory itself, the place where Ethan learned to ride his first bike, where my husband and I had built a small life from nothing, planting more dreams than seeds. I felt the ground shift beneath me as Ethan spoke, but before I could let the worry take root, Natalie reached for the document, scanning it carefully with a focus that surprised even me. "This doesn't look right," she murmured, brow furrowed. "The date here, and the signature, they don't match the timeline Ethan told me about." Her voice was steady, sharp in a way I hadn't heard before. Not cruel, not arrogant, but protective. It was the voice of someone taking responsibility. Over the next few days, she threw herself into the problem, calling offices, searching archives, even driving with me to the courthouse to dig through dusty records. Watching her there, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back, I saw the woman my son had fallen in love with. The fire, the intelligence, the determination. But this time that fire burned for the family she once dismissed. It wasn't easy. There were meetings where men spoke over her, moments where legal language twisted into confusion, but Natalie never backed down. "We'll prove this," she'd say to me each night, her tone filled with quiet conviction. I'd make tea and watch her pore over old deeds and bank notes at my kitchen table, her eyes tired but unyielding. Somewhere in those long evenings, something unspoken passed between us, a kind of respect born not out of words, but out of shared fight. One night, as rain tapped gently against the windows, I asked her, "Why are you doing all this, dear?" "It's not your burden." She looked up from the papers, her eyes glistening with something honest. "Because I was wrong about you," she said softly. "I thought strength was loud, but you've been strong all along, just quietly." My throat tightened at that, and for a moment, I saw the young woman she must have been before pride hardened her edges. "We're family now," she added. "Word family protects each other." A few days later, she found it, the mistake that cracked everything open. A bank receipt dated 3 years after the supposed deal, showing the full payment my husband had made in cash. The land was ours, fair and clear. Natalie smiled when she held it up, her face glowing with the kind of triumph that wasn't just about winning, but about doing right. We filed the proof, and within weeks, the claim was dismissed. Ethan was relieved, overjoyed even, but for me, the victory was deeper than property. I looked at Natalie and saw the lesson come full circle. The girl who had once called me useless had now fought to protect what I loved most. As we stood outside the courthouse, the sun breaking through the clouds, she turned to me and said, "You taught me what strength really looks like." I smiled, tears blurring my eyes, and replied, "No, dear. You just had to find it in yourself." And in that moment, for the first time, she hugged me, not out of politeness or guilt, but with the warmth of a daughter who had finally come home. After the court victory, the air around us felt lighter, but inside me, a storm still stirred quietly, a mix of relief, exhaustion, and the kind of ache that comes after carrying too much for too long. Natalie began visiting more often, bringing flowers for the garden, cooking dinner with me on weekends, even teasing Ethan when he forgot to take out the trash. Life began to resemble peace again, the kind of calm that doesn't come from perfection but from understanding. Yet, deep down, I sensed something unsettled in her. Sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, her smile would fade and her eyes would wander, lost somewhere far beyond the walls of the house. I tried not to pry. After all, every woman carries storms she doesn't speak of. But one evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, I noticed her hands trembling slightly as she dried the dishes. "Natalie," I said gently, "you look tired, dear. Is everything all right?" She froze for a moment, then forced a smile. "Just work stress," she said too quickly. I didn't push, but I filed the moment away, the way mothers do when their hearts whisper that something isn't quite right. Over the next few weeks, little things began to surface. Late night phone calls that ended abruptly when Ethan entered the room, her sudden absences, her distracted silences at the dinner table. One night, I heard her on the porch, her voice low but urgent, saying, "No, you can't come here. It's over. Please just let me go." When she saw me standing by the doorway, she flinched, guilt flashing across her face before she masked it with a nervous laugh. "Just work stuff," she said again. But I knew better. I didn't confront her immediately. Instead, I watched and waited, the same way I had when raising Ethan, knowing that sometimes people must reveal their own truth. And then, one rainy night, the truth came uninvited. A car pulled up outside the house, headlights slicing through the storm, and a man stepped out. A stranger with a familiar kind of arrogance. He pounded on the door, shouting Natalie's name. Ethan rushed to answer, confused, but before he could, I saw Natalie standing at the top of the stairs, pale as paper. "Don't open it," she said, her voice breaking. "Mom, please, don't let him in." That word, Mom, hit me like a jolt, but I didn't have time to process it. The man kept shouting, anger twisting his words, and I saw fear in Natalie's eyes that I hadn't seen even when she was hurt. Ethan was bewildered, demanding to know what was going on, but Natalie just cried, "He's from before you." I thought I left him behind. In that instant, everything clicked. The calls, the tremors, the haunted look. I stepped forward, calm and steady, and told Ethan to take her upstairs. Then I opened the door just enough to meet the man's eyes. "You need to leave," I said, my tone quiet but firm. He sneered, trying to push his way in, but I stood my ground. "Every inch of me steel," I said. "Leave." Perhaps it was something in my voice, or maybe he finally saw that I wasn't a woman to test, because he backed away, muttering threats as he left. I locked the door and went upstairs to find Natalie in tears, shaking uncontrollably. Without a word, I sat beside her, wrapping my arm around her shoulders as she sobbed into me. "I'm sorry," she whispered over and over. I thought I could outrun my past. I stroked her hair, my heart breaking for her. "You don't have to run anymore," I said softly. "You have family now, you have me." That night, I stayed with her until morning, my storm quieting as hers raged. Because sometimes, the only way to calm someone else's storm is to let them borrow your peace until they find their own again. The next morning, sunlight barely piercing through the gray clouds, Natalie and I sat at the kitchen table in silence, both of us too wary to speak, the events of the previous night still settling in our chests like heavy stones. Ethan was at work, and for once, the house felt like a sanctuary rather than a battlefield. I poured us both tea, my hand steady despite the adrenaline that had yet to leave my system, and Natalie clutched the cup as if it were a lifeline. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling but determined. "Mom, I should have told you sooner," she said, tears welling again. "Before we even married, he tried to control me, threatened me, and I was too scared to say anything. I thought I could handle it, that I could bury the past, but it followed me here." I reached across the table, my fingers brushing hers, and said, "Natalie, fear is not a sin, but silence can cost us everything. Thank you for trusting me now." Her eyes searched mine, wide and vulnerable, and I realized that beneath the arrogance and pride she had displayed before, there had always been a girl desperate for protection, for someone to see her for who she really was. That's when I decided that the lesson she would truly learn, the one that would stay with her forever, would not be punishment or humiliation. It would be strength and boundaries, the kind that come from love and unwavering courage. Over the next few days, we strategized together, documenting the threats, calling the authorities, and even contacting his acquaintances to warn them off. Natalie's posture changed as we worked side by side. Her head lifted, her voice grew steady, and I could see respect forming in her eyes. Not just for me, but for herself. She began to understand that calling someone useless was meaningless in the face of action and preparation, and that life always favors those who stand firm. I shared stories of my own battles, long nights alone after my husband's death, the weight of raising a family while carrying grief and responsibility. She listened, sometimes flinching at the raw honesty, other times nodding with newfound appreciation. One afternoon, as we sorted through a pile of old photographs, she paused and looked at me, whispering, "You were always stronger than I thought, stronger than anyone I've ever known." I smiled, the ache in my chest softening. "Strength isn't always loud, Natalie," I told her. "Sometimes it's quiet, enduring, and still standing when everyone else walks away." Weeks passed, and the man who had haunted her finally understood that neither threat nor intimidation would sway us. He attempted contact again, and I met him calmly at the door, explaining that any further harassment would be met with legal action. The fear that once loomed over Natalie dissipated, replaced by confidence she had never felt before, and I knew in that moment that the lesson had worked. She had learned resilience, and perhaps more importantly, respect. For herself, for me, and for the boundaries that protect family. That night, as she hugged me tightly before bed, she whispered, "Thank you for everything, Mom." And I realized, with a quiet pride, that sometimes the most profound victories come not from force or anger, but from showing someone the true measure of courage, compassion, and unwavering maternal strength. In the days that followed, Natalie's demeanor shifted in ways I hadn't expected. She no longer carried herself with the sharp arrogance that had once cut through our home like a blade. But there remained a tension, a hesitancy that told me she was still wrestling with her pride and guilt. Every morning, she would greet me softly, helping with small chores, offering to make breakfast or fold laundry, yet her eyes often darted away when I looked at her, as if searching for a way to express something she couldn't find the words for. One afternoon, as the sunlight spilled through the kitchen window and dust motes danced lazily in the warm glow, I watched her struggle to open a jar, her fingers trembling slightly. I laughed gently and went to help her, twisting the lid with ease and setting it down beside her. She sighed, half in relief, half in frustration, and muttered, "I guess I still have a lot to learn." I smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We all do, dear. Life has a way of teaching lessons, some in whispers and some in storms." She looked at me then, finally holding my gaze, and I could see the apology in her eyes, the one she couldn't voice, but that burned bright in the sincerity of her look. That night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Natalie sat at the dining table with me, a cup of tea steaming between our hands. The house was quiet, the only sounds the ticking clock and the wind rustling outside. She cleared her throat, hesitated, and finally whispered, "Mom, I know I've said terrible things. I can't take them back, but I want you to know I didn't mean them. I was foolish. I reached out, taking her hands in mine, and said softly, I know, Natalie. And sometimes, words are only as lasting as the actions that follow them. You've shown me who you are now, and that matters more than the mistakes you made before. Her shoulders sagged with relief, and I could feel the tension in her body ease for the first time. Over the next several weeks, that unspoken apology transformed into small gestures of respect and affection. She cooked meals without being asked, left notes of encouragement for Ethan and me, and even took the time to ask about my childhood, wanting to know the woman behind the title of mother-in-law. One evening, as we tended the garden together, she laughed at my old-fashioned ways of pruning the roses, and I laughed with her, realizing that the wall that had once separated us had crumbled entirely. And yet, beneath the laughter, there remained a quiet lesson, one she had learned not through confrontation, but through seeing the strength, patience, and unwavering resolve that defined a mother's love. That night, as I watched her prepare to leave, she hugged me tightly and whispered, "Thank you for being patient with me, for teaching me without ever raising your voice." And in that embrace, I realized that the words I had longed to hear from her, those apologies and acknowledgments, had been said without ever leaving her lips, carried instead in her actions, her respect, and the change in her heart that no force could have compelled. As weeks turned into months, the house began to feel alive in a way it hadn't since my husband had passed. Laughter echoed through the rooms again, not forced or hollow, but genuine, carrying the warmth of a family that had weathered storms and emerged stronger. Natalie no longer held herself apart from me or Ethan. She moved through the home with ease, helping with chores, sharing stories, even playfully teasing Ethan when he forgot to take out the trash or left his shoes in the hallway. One afternoon, as we sat in the living room with sunlight streaming through the curtains, I watched Natalie talk with Ethan about plans for their upcoming anniversary, offering thoughtful suggestions and listening attentively when he spoke. Her confidence had grown, not the kind born from arrogance or control, but the quiet, resilient kind that comes from having faced one's own fear and chosen love and respect instead. I felt a swell of pride, not for myself, but for the woman she had become, and for the bond we had forged in the wake of hardship. That evening, I decided to cook a special dinner for all three of us, a celebration not just of milestones or birthdays, but of the family we had rebuilt together. As the aroma of roasted chicken and herbs filled the kitchen, Natalie set the table carefully, her movements precise and graceful, glancing at me every now and then with a soft smile that spoke volumes. Ethan walked in, carrying groceries, and paused to take in the scene, a small laugh escaping him. "You two are like a team," he said warmly, and I nodded, feeling the truth in his words. The meal began, and conversation flowed naturally. Stories of the past, dreams for the future, and jokes that made all three of us laugh until our sides ached. I looked at Natalie then and saw how far she had come, from the girl who had once dismissed me as old and useless, to a woman who now stood beside me, united in love, respect, and understanding. Later that night, as we cleared the dishes and the kitchen glowed with the soft light of the lamp, Natalie turned to me quietly and said, "I never thought I could feel this close to my mother-in-law. I'm grateful for you, truly." I smiled, placing a hand over hers. "Family isn't always easy," I said. "But when we stand together, it's stronger than any storm." She nodded, and I could see in her eyes the lessons of patience, humility, and courage that had taken root. And for the first time in a long while, I felt the kind of contentment that doesn't come from winning battles or proving points. It comes from knowing that love, respect, and understanding had finally found their place in a home that had once been fractured, and that, together, we could face whatever challenges the world would send our way. Life, as it always does, found a way to test the bonds we had worked so hard to rebuild, and it came quietly, in the form of a family emergency that no one could have anticipated. One cold morning, Ethan received a call from his office, an urgent matter involving a client who had caused financial trouble that threatened to drag him into months of legal turmoil. Panic rippled through him as he tried to figure out a solution, but Natalie stepped in without hesitation, calmly assessing the situation and organizing paperwork, contacting attorneys, and gathering the necessary documents. I watched from the kitchen, tea in hand, as she worked tirelessly, her face focused and determined, guiding Ethan with gentle authority. It was in that moment I realized that the girl who had once belittled me had transformed into a partner capable of handling pressure with intelligence and grace. When I offered advice or suggested contacting someone, she listened attentively, her eyes reflecting respect and acknowledgement, no longer defiant or dismissive. Hours passed, the storm of stress outside mirrored by the storm of anxiety in the house, and yet Natalie never wavered. She stayed late into the night, helping Ethan draft statements, confirming appointments, and finally, when the work was done, she sat back, exhausted but triumphant. "We did it," she said quietly, her voice filled with both relief and pride. I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me, not just because the crisis had been averted, but because the lesson of respect and understanding had truly taken hold. Later, when she turned to me and whispered, "I couldn't have done this without you, Mom," I felt a surge of emotion, realizing that our relationship had reached a point where trust, respect, and love were no longer words. They were actions embedded in every gesture, every decision, every choice we made for each other. That night, as we sat together on the couch, the storm outside subsiding, I knew that the bridge we had built between us was now unshakable. The test had proven that respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned through patience, guidance, and unwavering support. And in seeing Natalie step into her own strength while embracing ours, I felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that the family we had forged, tempered through trials and tempered again by understanding, was stronger than ever before. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind of day when the sunlight spills softly through the windows and the house feels like it's breathing with you. That Natalie did something I had waited years to hear, not in words, but in a way that carried the weight of her heart. We were in the living room, Ethan out running errands, and she came over to help me fold laundry, her hands gentle yet confident as she worked beside mine. For a long moment, we were silent, the only sound the soft rustle of clothing. Then she paused, placing a folded sweater into my arms, and looked up at me with eyes that glistened with emotion. "Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I know I was wrong. I judged you too soon. And I said things I shouldn't have. I don't think I ever thanked you properly for everything you've done, for protecting me, for guiding me, for being here even when I didn't deserve it." My throat tightened as I felt the sincerity radiate from her words, a warmth I had hoped for but had almost stopped expecting. I reached for her hands, holding them gently in mine. "Natalie, you don't have to thank me," I said softly. "All a mother, or a mother-in-law, wants is to be needed, to be trusted, to know that the people we care for feel loved and safe." She shook her head, tears spilling freely now, and whispered, "No, Mom, I want you to know I see you. I respect you. I'm grateful for you, truly. I never want to take that for granted again." In that moment, I felt every hurt she had caused, every harsh word, dissolve, not because it had been erased, but because it had been transformed into understanding, into connection, into something far stronger than resentment. I pulled her into a hug, holding her close as she cried softly against me, and I realized that this, the quiet acknowledgement, the unspoken bond forged through trials, lessons, and shared struggles, was the moment when all the tension, the battles, and the pain melted into love and respect. From that day forward, every glance, every gesture, every conversation carried a depth we had never reached before. It wasn't perfection, but it was real, and it was lasting. I could see her walk through the house with newfound confidence, interact with Ethan not as a subordinate, but as an equal partner, and even approach me with warmth and openness that bridged years of misunderstanding. And as I watched her, my heart swelled, not with pride for myself, but with gratitude for the growth and courage that had blossomed in her. She had learned, truly learned, what it meant to honor the people who came before her, and I had seen firsthand that even the hardest hearts can soften when met with patience, wisdom, and unwavering maternal love. That afternoon, I realized that the greatest lesson wasn't the one I had intended to teach. It was the one she taught me, that forgiveness, understanding, and heartfelt gratitude can transform relationships in ways nothing else can, and that even the sharpest words can be softened by actions that speak louder than any apology ever could. The days and weeks that followed felt like the first real breaths after a long winter, when the air is crisp and clean, and the sun finally breaks through clouds that seemed endless. Natalie had changed in ways that were subtle but profound. She moved through the house with ease, no longer with the arrogance or detachment that had once made my heart ache, but with a quiet confidence, a respect that flowed naturally from understanding rather than fear. She would often come to me for advice, not because she needed me to fix her problems, but because she valued the perspective and wisdom that only comes from living through life's trials. I could see her taking lessons to heart in the way she spoke to Ethan, in the patience she displayed when things went wrong, in the way she approached me, not as someone who was old and useless, but as a woman who understood the depth and strength of the hands that raised her husband, nurtured a family, and carried love through decades. One afternoon, as we sat together on the porch, sipping tea and watching the golden light stretch across the yard, Natalie reached over and took my hand in hers. She didn't need to say much. Her eyes said it all: gratitude, respect, affection, and a promise that the bridge we had built was not fragile, but strong and enduring. I thought about the journey we had traveled, from the moment she had uttered those cruel words, to the nights of storm and fear, to the lessons in strength, courage, and compassion that we had shared. I realized that the fire I had once thought to use as a weapon had never been meant for destruction. It had been a flame of guidance, patience, and steadfast love, and in its warmth, Natalie had learned, grown, and changed. She had discovered humility without shame, courage without recklessness, and respect that came from the heart rather than obligation. That evening, as Ethan joined us and the three of us laughed over a simple meal, I felt a profound sense of peace, a deep, lasting understanding that the trials of the past had given birth to something far more valuable than pride or vengeance. We had become a family not bound merely by blood or marriage, but by trust, love, and the lessons earned through adversity. I looked at Natalie, now smiling softly, her eyes gentle and sincere, and whispered to myself, "This is what I hoped for, this is what matters." And in that moment, I knew that even the harshest words, the deepest hurts, and the most challenging storms could not break the bonds of a family committed to each other, for respect and love, once truly earned, last forever. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought of the path that had led us here, the anger, the fear, the lessons, the apologies unspoken but felt in every act, and I realized with a full heart that the greatest victory had never been teaching Natalie a lesson about words or respect. It had been creating a bond strong enough to endure life's storms, a bond built on understanding, courage, forgiveness, and love, a bond that would last unshaken for the rest of our days, and that no one, not even the cruelest words or the darkest past, could ever undo.